Friends Center, and it has something to do with Quakers. And Doug Gwyn is going to tell us about the history of the Quakers. So,
my name is Doug Gwyn. I teach at a Quaker adult learning center, Pendle Hill, about 10 miles west of here in the suburbs of Philadelphia. And I was asked to come over and tell you a little bit about Friends. I'm aware you've had a long day already, so I don't want to take a lot of time telling you about things that may not be what you're most interested in. So why don't I say a little about Quakers in the world today and a bit of our history, and then open it up to what questions you have. Does that sound like a good way to proceed? Okay. I suppose Friends Quakers are known most of all for our silent ways of worship, lack of clergy, spontaneous spirit-led ministry out of the silence in worship, commitment to peace and egalitarian ways of being in the world, a belief that a divine light shines in the conscience of each person and can lead anyone to a transformed and redeemed life, whatever their beliefs may be. We also, while we have this belief of the light of God in each person's conscience, it's not an individualistic religion. We attempt to come to unity in making decisions together as the Spirit leads, which can sometimes be a long process without resorting to voting. So patience is one of the things you learn as a Quaker, I guess. But we're a small group, about 90,000 friends in North America, probably no more than 300,000 in the world altogether. The largest concentration of friends are actually in East Africa, mainly in Kenya. Another large concentration in Bolivia, all of them above 10,000 feet. About 45,000 there. And majority of friends in this worldwide picture would be fairly evangelical, without much or perhaps no silence in their worship. Many of them have pastoral leadership, and services that look kind of like low church Protestantism. Other friends, such as those that predominate here in the Philadelphia area and much of the East Coast and other parts of the country, as well as Britain and Europe, Australia and elsewhere, would be of this more traditional silent worship style without professional leadership. And again, speaking that takes place would be unprepared, spontaneous, spirit-led. Their theology, while as this evangelical majority would be very, very strongly Christian in orientation, friends around here would be a combination of some quite happily Christian friends, as well as others that would see themselves in a more universalist vein of outlook, more humanistic probably, and there's a growing phenomenon of non-theistic friends today in America and elsewhere. That's quite a range in one religious tradition, and it kind of mystifies even Quakers at times how we got to that kind of spread of theological outlooks. And sometimes when large gatherings of friends get together and people meet these Quakers of a very different kind, they can really be scandalized and shocked at what seems like random acts of violence against my Quakerism that I've come to know and love. So, having grown up in the pastoral tradition in the Midwest and having spent time in both major streams over the years, there's things I like about both and can call either one home. But they don't compare well to each other. They're just very different ideas of what Quakers are. I think probably there's a number of things you can point to of how we got to that spread. One is that we don't have a creed, so we have no historic normative definitions of our belief. And we're a very flat, relatively non-hierarchical society, so that we don't, if a group of friends come to unity to a certain understanding of what they're about, there's no one to tell them, no, you can't do that. So it has, particularly in America, with spread across the frontier, there was a lot of hybridization that took place between Quakerism and frontier Methodism and revivalism that created the pastoral stream, and that got exported to Latin America and Africa. So that's certainly one of the reasons that that friends have morphed in these different directions. And while the form of Quakerism changed in that evangelical hybridization, adopting pastors and a program of worship, the theology of the unprogrammed or the silent tradition has also morphed in different ways. A lot of dialogue with Unitarianism in American history and British Quaker history has led to the more humanistic and universalist view of Quakerism. So there's been, sometimes unprogrammed friends think we're the ones that have stayed the same, but actually there's a lot of evolution going on in both branches. But I think one of the keys to understanding it is that Quakers arose in England in the 1650s after the English Civil War and after the English Reformation had kind of reached a stalemate. The Puritans had won the Civil War, but they began to shatter and argue among themselves at different parties of how the true church should be organized and what its creed should be and all of that. So Quakers arise when the belief that you can kind of reconstruct the New Testament church by chapter and verse from the New Testament no longer seems to hold water, and there's movement not only among friends but some other groups as well that the church has to be sort of reinvented by the power of the Spirit that invented the church in the first place. You get many people in England during the Civil War of the 1640s dropping out from all the churches. These were called seekers, actually. They were seeking a true church. They were not happy seekers, happily sampling this and that, but really mournful people that were kind of hyper-Puritans, really longing to be part of a church they could really believe in and very concerned about sin and their eternal destiny. And a lot of these were just kind of waiting for new apostles, a new revelation of the Spirit of some kind. And the Quaker movement began in the north of England. A man named George Fox, who seemed to have a gift for helping people ground themselves in an experience of the presence of God, or what he called the light within, or the Spirit within, and that could actually lead them to the kind of life and lead them together to become the kind of church that these forlorn seekers had been looking for. To many of them, that meant, oh, we're going to find our way back to the purity of the New Testament church, primitive Christianity revived. But for others in this seeking scene, they said, well, why would God take us back to a church that went into apostasy, corrupted? They believed, after the apostles' generation in the first century. Surely God is not going to take us back, but going to take us forward into a new age and a higher revelation, a new age of the Spirit, and a Spirit that's poured out on all flesh, as Peter prophesied at Pentecost in Acts 2, I guess it is, and that's going to be what this light or Spirit-led people is about. So these people were kind of leaning forward rather than the others leaning back. And George Fox had a gift for getting them to sort of quit speculating about the future or longing for the glories of the first century church, but to become radically present in the present to the divine presence of God within and among them. He would counsel them to stand still in the light and let the light show you as you really are, and show you what needs to be strengthened, what needs to be cast out and let go of. And this spiritual counsel really began to take hold, and a movement grew very rapidly in those early days in the 1650s. So you can see that in some ways, Quakers are coming at the end of the Reformation, but a little ahead of the liberal Enlightenment. And by the 1670s, you've got ideas of universal reason and the light being reason in the human conscience that can lead us to human progress and human betterment in the world. I think Quakers, being at that cusp of transition between the Protestant Reformation and the liberal Enlightenment, has given us kind of leanings in both directions. So that as time went on and Quakers spread around Britain and America, we began to feel the gravitational pull of those two major cultural watersheds of Anglo-American culture, the Protestant Reformation and the liberal Enlightenment, so that we get pulled towards the Protestant church or the evangelical movement, or into the liberal Enlightenment and more universalist ideas of what we're about. So that's a bit of how we got to that kind of spread out of a central paradox that friends believed that one of Fox's main messages was that Christ has come to teach his people himself. It was kind of a second coming message, really, except that it wasn't Christ coming down out of the heavens, but through the conscience of each person to teach and gather people into a new society. But that would really end the world, end the world's way of doing things and create a new society. And friends developed what we call our testimonies, what we have kind of distilled into a number of ethical values, you might call them, of peace, equality, community, integrity of words and acts, simplicity, and we sometimes add sustainability today. Pardon? Sustainability. So those developed early on in our history as kind of ways that we believe the kingdom of heaven takes form among humans on earth. when we're faithful to the light within. Early Friends in the first decade were quite a confrontational and uproarious bunch that quickly drew a lot of persecution because they were trying to disestablish the National Church of England, believing that forcing people to conform to a creed and to attend parish church services was violence to the human conscience, and that people needed to be free to gather as they were led. So while their commitment to peace was clear, they were also very confrontational. They generated a lot of conflict, and they drew a lot of violence upon themselves, a lot of persecution. About 450 Quakers in England and Wales died under persecution in the first 30, 40 years of the movement. That sort of nonviolent cultural revolution from the grassroots that the Quaker movement started out to be in the first decade or so was pretty well stomped, and the persecution began to contain and subdue the rapid-fire development of the movement. William Penn was a second-generation convert to the movement, son of the Lord of the Admiralty in England. Admiral Penn was a good friend of Charles II after the restoration of monarchy in 1660, and lent the king a lot of money. And the king repaid that by giving Penn's son, William Penn, a colonial charter, a rather vast colonial charter. So much so that people say this is more than the repayment of a loan. Charles, actually, although Charles was a kind of not too secret Catholic, he liked Quakers because they were tolerant, and he knew that Penn would develop a colony that would tolerate his Catholic brethren and sisters, and would be very tolerant to a wide variety of religious groups. So Penn got this big charter in 1680 and came over in 1682, founded Philadelphia, came to a treaty and purchase of land with the local Lenape people here. Very respectful relations because of the Quaker belief that the light is in all people. They could come to a mutually accountable and peaceful relationship with the native peoples. So Penn started this colony with a pretty enlightened view of how to run a colony. Capital punishment offenses were something like 50 offenses that could get you hanged in Massachusetts, only one in Pennsylvania. So I think it was murder. It may have been treason, but I think it was murder. So Penn advertised his colony all around Europe to gather all the persecuted sectarian groups around Europe into Pennsylvania with this promise of religious toleration and freedom. So Pennsylvania quickly became this kind of religious Disneyland that had all kinds of groups. And these little sectarian groups from Europe tended to band together with the Quakers in governing the colony. And the Quakers managed to control the colony for the first 75 years, I guess, until the French and Indian War forced their hand. They were either going to have to raise money for the British to fight the war, or they were going to have to start withdrawing from government. And so Friends withdrew from government in Pennsylvania. But Penn's experiment, what he called his holy experiment in Pennsylvania, was I think, a really enlightened utopian experiment that also had a lot of influence on the shape of American religious liberty, and some influence on the formation of the U.S. Constitution as well. Quakers withdrew kind of after they gave up on running Pennsylvania, withdrew more and more into a kind of a sectarian, quietist profile well into the 19th century. And then as the 19th century goes on, you begin to see them finding allies, among the evangelicals on one side or the Unitarians on the other side. Mostly an interest for social reform of various kinds that drew them into those associations and began to influence their own practice of Quakerism. Just to try to move this along, some of our heroes along the way, John Woolman was a colonial New Jersey minister among friends who was a very deep soul. He became one of the key figures in working for the abolition of slavery. For all their egalitarian values, as soon as friends moved across the ocean to the Americas, they took up slaveholding like everybody else. There were some friends that were against it from the very beginning, but it got started and it was very hard, again, finding unity in the spirit, to finally get the unity to start withdrawing from slaveholding and then becoming a key force in American politics for the abolition of slavery in the 19th century. Woolman is credited as, although there were many other friends that were working to get friends out of holding slaves, he's seen to be the central figure. Wrote some beautiful essays on against slaveholding and for economic justice of various kinds. He's a powerful, powerful figure. Lucretia Mott is another of our heroes. I think a denizen of this meeting until her death in 1870, I believe. Quite a powerful small woman who could just sort of read the tendency of events and see where things were going for Friends and for America as a cutting-edge reformer, first in the cause of abolition and then in the women's rights movement. She was one of the key figures in the first Seneca Falls Convention in the 1840s, I guess that was. So she was one of the first to articulate that Quakers should not only be resisting participation in war or even non-payment of taxes for war, but should actually be agitating politically against war to try to end war. An assignment we're still working on. Rufus Jones is another key figure. He grew up on a farm in Maine, rural Maine, but he was a long-time professor at Earlham College here in the Philadelphia area.
That's actually Indiana, Earlham.
I'm sorry, Haverford. I'm from Indiana. I guess I had a lapse there. Thank you. Haverford College. He just had a real genius, not only for updating the understanding of Quakerism as a kind of a mystical stream of Christianity, but a kind of group mysticism and a socially engaged mysticism, but also a genius for creating institutions that could express that new modernized understanding of Quakerism. He is the central figure in the founding of the American Friends Service Committee a century ago this year, and whose central offices are here in this building. So he is another key figure in our history to make mention of. out of that innovation also came the Friends Committee on National Legislation, the first religious lobbying organization in the United States, which still does a lot of work in Washington. That's perhaps enough, and maybe I should open it up to what questions you may have, either clarifications on something I've said or things that you were hoping to learn this evening. Yes, I think you had your hand up first.
As a student of women's history, I found there's a long line of Quaker women who are public friends but are out there. Every reform movement in American history has a Quaker woman in some sort of leadership. So I wonder if you could explain that. Why were women so able to be public leaders and what they accomplished?
Thank you. That's a good question, and something that I had somewhere in my notes that I meant to get to. So that seems to be from the very genesis of the Quaker movement. We had a lot of women's leadership from the very beginning. It was a very charismatic movement in the first decades, sort of itinerant preachers or prophets going out in pairs, men in pairs and women in pairs, and preaching the gospel in the streets and the marketplaces, interrupting church services in the local parish, this sort of thing. And women were right on the cutting edge of that. Before Quakers, sometimes there were some women prophets in some of the other radical groups, Baptists and Congregationalists, but they sort of always had to be protected under the aegis of a male clergyman. Whereas in the next decade, in the Quaker movement, these women were just going out and doing it themselves. It seems to be partly a kind of partnership style that Fox had with some key women in the early development of his ministry, and certainly the most important one being Margaret Fell, who they eventually married. She was quite a powerful figure in her own right, a member of the lesser gentry in the North, made her home a center for the movement in the North, and handled the finances and correspondence of the movement. She wrote, while spending 4 years in jail in Lancaster Castle, a tract called Women Speaking Justified. And it was the most categorical defense of the right or the authority of women to speak in the church, finding whole new ways of reading Paul's letters that were a big surprise to most of their Puritan contemporaries. That's considered really one of the classic proto-feminist tracts written in 1666. And that seems, to have set the tone for this strong. Women and men had separate business meetings. The men's meeting probably had a little more power overall, but the fact that the women had their own kind of formation group of nurturing leadership among themselves and not being in these mixed groups where they might be more likely to defer to the men seemed to be a way of nurturing women's leadership so that it comes out in lots of ways, particularly by the 19th century with not only Lucretia Mott, but the Grimke sisters and Susan B. Anthony and a lot of others since then. So yeah, you're right, that's a key component of our tradition. Having this sense of the indwelling of Christ, Margaret Fell would say, Christ will hear, you can hear Christ speaking through the female as well as you can hear Christ speaking through the male. It's in some ways a kind of a theocentric defense rather than a humanistic defense, but it quickly translates into a more humanistic definition of women's rights. Yes.
Could you say something about the Quaker impact? Because I know there was one in terms of conscientious objectors in World War II and especially in Vietnam. You know, the I.S.I.S.
Yes, yes. The American Defense Service Committee was founded in 1917, most acutely probably to create a vehicle by which conscientious objectors could render service in France and elsewhere during the war in some rather dangerous situations, and relief work, and work with refugees, so that it kind of created a channel that would justify to the government that these were people ready to do serious work and not just shirking from military duty. And that kind of established conscientious objection for particularly Quakers and the other two historic peace churches, Mennonites and Brethren. And that carried over fairly automatically, I think, into the Second World War as well. Dan Seeger, a Quaker from New York in the 1950s, I think, won a Supreme Court case that expanded the definition of the basis for conscientious objection to a non-religious, non-theistic basis. Dan was head of the I.S.I.S office in New York for many years, and then director of Pendle Hill for a number of years. I.S.I.S offices and a number of friends' meetings were quite active in draft counseling during the Vietnam War, which helped expand the range of people that could see how to make that kind of application. Still a lot depended on which draft board you were fortunate or unfortunate to live near, but yeah, the friends really helped spread that option more widely. Yes.
There's a statue out in the courtyard at the entrance to the Friends Center. I think it's a Quaker activist, a woman named Mary Dyer, who my understanding is she was hanged by the Massachusetts colony for her, I'm not sure what it was, her activism, or apparently Quakerism was banned in the Massachusetts colony, and I was wondering what was that all about? I thought Massachusetts was the center of enlightened tolerance for religion, and but there may be another side to that.
Yeah, I mean, the founders of Massachusetts were not interested in religious liberty so much as the chance to found their own theocracy in Massachusetts. So Quakers kept showing up and preaching the Quaker message and getting whipped through the streets or thrown in jail, and eventually on the second or third offense exiled, and if they came back they could face hanging. And four Quakers were hanged, including 3 men and Mary Dyer. So I mean, there was some forbearance on the Puritans' part, but these friends were not going to go away, and so she was sentenced to death. And there's a lovely anecdote on her way to the gallows. There was someone who I think was trying to be sympathetic, said, you know, you'll soon be in heaven. And she said, I've been in heaven for a couple of weeks now. So heaven for her was doing God's will and not being intimidated by the Puritan establishment in Massachusetts. So that's a bit about Mary Dyer. There's another statue of the same, as a copy of the same statue on the Boston Common where she was hanged. So they've tried to make good on it, I guess.
Hi. Quakers are known for their conflict resolution efforts.
Yes.
Could you speak to some of the approaches, particularly within the Quaker community? I've been at 2 discernment meetings, and they're stunning to me a bit.
I think the original model that Friends were working from was Jesus' advice in Matthew 18 on disagreements within the community, that you should work those out on the smallest possible basis, one-on-one if possible, and then bring more people into it to try to sort it out. And that has usually been successful. You can't always, people dig in sometimes, and you can't always come to unity. But we've also brought some of what we've learned from that tradition out into the world, not only in arbitration of international conflicts, but, for example, the Alternatives to Violence project, starting out in prisons, but now expanding internationally and more widely, was started by Quakers that were taking some of the Friends principles to the prisons where confrontation could be so violent, and yet many of the men were looking for another way. Maybe, was there more to your question than I'm answering?
When you have disagreements among a meeting house on issues, and you need to resolve them through consensus,
okay.
That's quite stunning.
Okay. Yeah, it can be a slow and painful process, it has to be said. Just not necessarily a conflict, but just a disagreement on how to proceed, which can, of course, become a more serious conflict. The clerk has a great responsibility. The clerk is the person who facilitates the process of the group trying to make the decision, recognizes people wanting to speak from the group, less of a leader than a reader of the group, having to really listen and pick up where the tendency of the conversation is going, and very carefully, when the time seems right, try to articulate an emerging unity. We sometimes use the word consensus, but it's really that's a more secular term. At the depth of our tradition, we prefer to say unity, or the leading of the Spirit, or God's will. And sometimes there will be honest disagreement that remains, and when most of the group is ready to decide something one way and one or two people still don't see it that way, then the clerk might ask, are you willing to stand aside from this decision? And if the individual perceives that it's not a harmful decision, then he or she might feel able to stand aside. They may want, they may ask to be minuted as having stood aside, so that I can say, I told you so. But sometimes an individual will not stand aside, and then usually the clerk will carry over that item of business till the next business meeting, and some careful conversation will take place between meetings. A lot of the work of a clerk is between meetings for business, to have the one-on-one conversations that can help move things forward. if a person, if the clerk and the group begin to discern that this individual is just being stubborn and is enjoying holding a whole group of people at bay, the group could go ahead and make that decision over that person's objection. But you don't want to. You certainly don't want to let that happen very often.
Name Quakers derived?
Should I come closer? Okay, sorry. It was a nickname. There were a lot of nicknames for radical groups in those days: levelers, diggers, seekers, ranters. Quakers, the way George Fox remembers it, a judge that was throwing him in prison for a year called him a Quaker because he bid the judge to tremble at the word of the Lord, to learn some reverence and awe. And there actually was a lot of quaking, trembling, shaking, even falling down in early meetings for worship in the earliest, most charismatic phase. So that's how the name derived. And we sort of eventually adopted it. But friends or friends of the truth, children of the light, were names we first chose for ourselves. Yes?
The poor woman who was hung in Massachusetts, what did she accomplish by dying there?
Probably a contribution towards the eventual religious toleration in Massachusetts. But you can never draw straight lines to those things. For her, I think it was just she was being faithful to her leading, and would not have banked too much on making history come out right.
Does not work. Now it works. Could you tell us a little bit about education? So how do you install the Quaker values into children growing up?
Education seems to be one of our strengths. A lot of Quaker schools, and they are usually very, very highly rated as good springboards onto college and professions. I guess, you know, I said that early catchphrase of George Fox was, "Christ has come to teach his people himself," and there's a kind of sense that the Quaker way of learning to listen to the light is listening to an inward teacher, and that somehow that translates to a gift for education in our tradition. So Quaker schools are usually, almost always, predominantly non-Quaker students, and often non-Quaker teachers as well. So it's often they have at least one silent meeting, maybe half an hour of silent worship per week in a Quaker school, to learn something of that. And the kids, you know, fight it the whole time, and then 10 years later they think, oh, well, that wasn't so bad. They may even go check out a friend's meeting. But often we work on teaching those basic, what we call testimonies, but sometimes get called Quaker values, the simplicity, peace, integrity, community, equality, sustainability. And later this month I'll be giving a talk on the peace testimony at Friends Central School here in Philadelphia to their faculty and staff, because they're going to focus as a school on the peace testimony. Last year they were on simplicity, this year they're on peace. And so they're going to try to gear up to inculcate their students with teachings of peace. So, yeah, without trying to push the Quaker sectarian line too much, we do try to spread those basic values which most people find good for young people to learn.
Quick one, but do you have like a special training for teachers on the Quaker schools too, or is it?
There are some education programs in some of the Quaker colleges. Earlham in Indiana has a good education master's program. I'm not sure about the other Quaker schools, but we also have the Friends Council on Education, which works to help Quaker schools and learn from each other in best practices for Quaker education. We also have the Friends Association for Higher Education that brings Quaker colleges and Quakers in education in other colleges together to strengthen their witness. Yes. Okay.
One of the things we appreciate very much of the Quakers is the idea of freedom of conscience. Is there some literature or some ideas what exactly you think, or what in Quakership is the conscience of a human being? You talked about the inner teacher, I heard you saying that, but is there more? What we can learn, what a Quaker think is his conscience?
That's a good question. Quakers and Puritans wrangled about that question a lot in the 17th century. I'm sorry, okay. Traditionally, we have believed that the conscience is a natural human faculty, but that the divine presence, light, abides in the conscience and can shape the conscience in good ways, so that the conscience would be understood as shaped by parents, teachers, other social factors, but at a deeper level, it is also being influenced by a divine light that is from beyond.
Described. There is no description of what is beyond.
It varies. Today, different Quakers would give different answers to that. For some, it's still God, Christ, Holy Spirit. For others, it would be one's truest self, or kind of perhaps the Jungian capital S self. Friends would give a lot of different definitions.
Just wanted to ask, because in the beginning you were speaking about the deists, the traditionalists, etc. Do they talk with each other to come to unified conclusions amongst themselves instead of just within their particular group?
Yeah. One of our organizations is called the Friends World Committee for Consultation, which brings different kinds of Quakers together for consultation. You know, no real expectation that they're going to agree, but hopefully understand each other a little bit better and be less scandalized by one another, so that maybe some mutual appreciation grows. But, and yeah, we might grow a little closer together, but we still have big differences.
I have a question, and the question is in line of the answer you give to about consciousness. Is it true that Quakers believe or think that the divine part is in the consciousness, is in the man self?
Is what?
The divine part.
Is, what was the last part?
In the man, in himself, within man, sorry.
Some would say.
Okay.
Traditionally, we would say that it is the divine and not the human. But some friends today would say it's...
Some make a distinction.
Yeah.
It is out, and others say it is in. For the people who think it is in, what's happening when the people dying with the divine spot?
When they die?
Yeah. Is it then still a part of consciousness what we call divine? Yeah.
That's a good question.
Yes.
I'm not sure I'm not sure I know I can think of a Quaker historical answer to that question.
Yes. Well, probably if you don't know it, we invite you tomorrow. Maybe we can help you.
If you solve it, yeah.
To investigate it.
If you solve it, let me know.
No. Maybe we can help each to realize where it is. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. Again, there would probably be a range of views. Yes.
My question has to do with the silence of your worship, which it sounds like a form of meditation in the sense of each person, and maybe you can clarify how people do that, whether they focus on a certain idea or image, or they sit in silence and try to be open, or there's some process there of opening up to the light within. So can you discuss what happens there?
That's a good question too. This week's Quaker Speak video, which can be found through YouTube, is on that very subject, whether Quaker worship is meditation or not. And the consensus seemed to be that there's overlap between Quaker worship and meditation, but they're not exactly the same thing. And that meditation practices can be very helpful for quieting the mind and centering the consciousness. But that in Quaker understanding, you're also opening up to the divine as well as what's coming through the other people in the room. And so that, you know, if a person is given a message to speak out of the silence, they would rise and speak, which would not be typical of most meditation practices. So there's definitely some overlap, and a number of Quakers have advanced in their Quaker worship through meditation practices, myself included. Anything else? I know it's been a long day for you folks, and okay, a couple more.
So, are there certain rituals that the Quakers do? Is there ceremonies, rituals, etc.?
We like to think not, but it's I guess anytime a group gets together in a regular way, certain minimal rituals are inevitable. trying to think perhaps more norms than rituals. If you feel like you're receiving a message that should be shared with the group, you should stand and speak and make it as brief as possible, and sit down, and then if somebody else has another message, they should wait a while, let the group really receive and absorb the previous message before standing. We always close the meeting with shaking of hands, which is kind of a sign of covenant and unity together. Our marriage ceremony is very simple. The couple comes, it's basically a silent meeting. The couple comes in, and when they're clear to do so, they'll stand and exchange a very simple promise to one another, and then sit down, and the rest of the group can speak to their knowledge of those individuals and their hopes for them, perhaps offer a prayer. And we, because we don't have clergy to sign the certificate, we all sign the certificate. That's one of the nice things about a Quaker wedding. They draw up a big piece of parchment, usually with lines on it, which tells the vow or promise that the couple made to each other, and then all the people that witnessed it. And it's the group that married the couple, and not a clergyman. So that's one of our rituals that I'm particularly fond of. And yeah.
Coming back on the element of making decisions, consensus, how is that implemented through the whole organization? Because if you are a big organization, I think you have some decisions to make, and if you want to do that on basis of consensus, how is that organized?
When it's a big organization like the board for the American Friends Service Committee, you get some very experienced Quakers to make those decisions together, because yeah, it's, you know, you get 50, 100 people in a room, and you want everybody operating at the best of their ability in that situation. It can work.
Bylaws in your organization or not? Bylaws.
I guess, yeah.
Well, maybe called it guidelines.
Yeah, certainly if it's a non-profit organization, it has to, but its decision-making process will remain on a largely implicit basis of Quaker understandings of how to make decisions together.
What is your experience by making decisions based on consensus? Is that very sustainable? Is that something that can run for a very long time? Is everybody more happy in the decisions? Is the decisions more well supported?
Well, they say that one of the advantages is that it may take a long time to make decisions in unity, but you're not creating unhappy minorities. Everybody that was there, you know, has to own the decision if they didn't object, and they may be less enthusiastic about the decision, but they can't complain. And that you can sometimes move from decision to implementation more quickly when a decision has been made in unity, because you're not still sorting out the differences of opinion. You can get on with it and implement the decision.
although some people think different, in our organization, the one I represent, consensus is something what we exercise quite often, and it works very well.
Yeah, you know, you need people operating in good faith and as honestly with themselves and with one another as possible. But it's if you have that, it's the better way to work, I think. Thank you. Maybe that's it. Thank you, friends. Pleasure to be with you this evening.
Thank you, Doug, so much for coming by here and letting us know. Appreciate it.
The rest of your meetings are good.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Jonathan, yeah.
Good to meet you.
Okay, take care.